I will have to say I was the reason. It was me. They loved me for who I was and immediately started trying to change me.
In 1975, Gregg Allman, the lead singer of the Allman Brothers Band, married Cher, Hollywood's top pop star. A rebellious rocker with a wild lifestyle and a dazzling entertainment icon, everyone thought they would become a legendary couple. But just 9 days later, Cher filed for divorce. What happened behind closed doors? What caused a love that seemed perfect to crumble in less than 2 weeks? Gregg Allman admitted, "I was the reason everything fell apart." But was it really that simple? When alcohol, drugs, and irreconcilable differences creep into a relationship, can love truly conquer all? This wasn't just a failed marriage. This was a story of passion, expectations, and a bitter lesson that sometimes loving each other doesn't mean you can walk the same path to the end. Let's uncover the hidden truths behind the turbulent marriage of Gregg Allman and Cher. Gregg Allman once admitted, "She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen." From the moment he first met Cher in 1975, he was instantly captivated. But that love at first sight was not the beginning of a fairy tale romance. It was more like a storm, passionate, intense, but difficult to sustain. That year, Cher had just finalized her divorce from Sonny Bono, ending a relationship that had lasted over a decade. Only 4 days later, she met Gregg Allman, the frontman of the Allman Brothers Band, one of the most influential Southern rock bands of the time. From the very first moment, Gregg was mesmerized by Cher. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, strong, independent, with a dazzling reputation and an irresistible charm. To him, Cher was like an unattainable dream, someone he never thought he could reach. Yet, the unexpected happened. They were drawn to each other like opposing forces, unable to resist the pull. However, from the very beginning, their differences were evident. Cher came from the glamorous world of Hollywood, where career, image, and fame meant everything. Gregg, despite being a rock star, came from a completely different world, gritty, rebellious, and unbound by any rules. He had no interest in the bright lights of Hollywood and even less desire to be tied to the glamorous life Cher embraced. But love is not always rational. They fell for each other quickly, intensely, without considering what might come next. And that impulsiveness led to a decision neither of them had fully thought through. Their overwhelming passion led them to a rushed marriage. After just a few days of dating, Gregg Allman and Cher tied the knot in a small chapel in Las Vegas on June 30th, 1975. No long-term plans, no careful preparation, just two people swept away by emotions. However, just 9 days later, Cher unexpectedly filed for divorce. The entertainment world was left in shock. What could have happened in such a short time? The biggest reason was Gregg Allman's heroin addiction. Cher quickly realized that no matter how much she loved him, she couldn't live with a man consumed by alcohol and drugs. She didn't want to relive the pain of her previous marriage, nor did she want to be pulled into Gregg's chaos. Moreover, their different lifestyles became increasingly apparent. Cher was a global icon, constantly appearing on television and at prestigious events, while Gregg felt alienated from that world. He loved music, but he wanted no part of Hollywood's glitz and noise. Faced with this harsh reality, Cher decided to walk away. But the story didn't end there. Even after filing for divorce just over a week later, Cher hesitated. She couldn't easily abandon such a passionate love. Both of them knew that if they could find a way to bridge their differences, they had a chance to start over. So, Cher withdrew the divorce petition and tried to mend their marriage. For more than 2 years, she did everything she could to help Gregg fight his addiction. She sought out experts, educated herself on how to support an addict, and tried to pull him out of the vicious cycle of alcohol and drugs. But Gregg couldn't change. Although their love was strong enough to bring a child into the world, their son, Elijah Blue Allman, it wasn't strong enough to keep them together. Cher was exhausted. Being a mother, supporting Gregg, and maintaining her career, she realized she couldn't keep sacrificing herself any longer. In 1977, Cher officially separated from Gregg Allman. 2 years later, in 1979, their marriage ended in divorce. Gregg Allman and Cher loved each other in the most intense, impulsive, and heartbreaking way. They threw themselves into the relationship with passion, but couldn't overcome the vast differences between them. Gregg once admitted, "I was the reason everything fell apart." But was that the whole truth? Their marriage was not just a failure, it was a bitter lesson about love and the things that cannot be changed. Passion may burn brightly, but without a solid foundation, it can fade just as quickly as it ignited. From the very beginning, Gregg Allman and Cher belonged to two different worlds, a gap that no amount of effort could bridge. In a later interview, Gregg openly admitted that he could never adapt to the lavish lifestyle of Beverly Hills, just as Cher could never give up the spotlight to live a quiet life in the American South. He loved simplicity. The small diners, the sound of blues drifting through local bars, and the freedom of traveling the road with his guitar. In contrast, Cher was deeply tied to the glamorous world of A-list celebrities, where every party was a red carpet event and personal image was always the top priority. This led to ironic situations. When Cher brought Gregg to high-profile events, he often felt out of place, uncomfortable with the forced social conversations and the blinding flashes of the paparazzi. Conversely, when Gregg tried to bring Cher to the South, she struggled to fit into a lifestyle where no one cared about fame or the latest fashion trends. These differences became even more pronounced when a much bigger issue emerged: Gregg's addiction. If their contrasting lifestyles were merely an obstacle, drugs were the force that pushed their marriage to the brink of collapse. Shortly after their wedding, Cher realized that Gregg was not just a talented musician, but also a man battling heroin and alcohol addiction. She wasn't just dealing with a difficult husband. She was facing a fight she could never win. Cher did everything she could to help Gregg escape his addiction. She sought out experts, contacted rehab centers, and even changed aspects of her own lifestyle in hopes of pulling him out of the abyss. But all efforts were in vain. Gregg didn't want to change, or if he did, he simply couldn't. In a bitter interview, Cher once said, "I can't spend my life trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Beyond their lifestyles and addiction struggles, their careers also drove them further apart. Cher was a music icon, but she wasn't content with just that. She wanted to expand into acting, build her personal brand, and extend her influence across various entertainment industries. She worked relentlessly, constantly searching for new projects to maintain her standing. Meanwhile, Gregg cared only about Southern rock and touring. He had no interest in being tied to the Hollywood entertainment machine, nor did he care about the movies or high-end endorsement deals that Cher pursued. He once admitted that he couldn't understand Cher's fascination with extravagant parties and elite events where people only talked about fashion and fame. On the other hand, Cher felt that Gregg was too closed off in his own world, refusing to engage in the things she was passionate about. They tried to find common ground, but ultimately couldn't, and the distance between them only grew wider. In the end, it was no surprise that their marriage came to an end. They may have loved each other, but they couldn't live together. Gregg Allman could never abandon the free-spirited lifestyle of a rocker, and Cher could never lose herself in a life that didn't belong to her. Their irreconcilable differences, the addiction that couldn't be conquered, and the career ambitions that pulled them in opposite directions made it impossible for them to stay together. Passion may bring two people together, but it's not always enough to keep them together forever. Looking back on his life, Gregg candidly admitted that most of his marriages didn't last for one simple reason: he refused to change. The women who entered his life loved him for who he was at first, a free-spirited, passionate musician, a man who lived for his music and never conformed to societal expectations. But over time, they wanted him to become someone different, more responsible, more stable, more in control of himself. And that was something he could never accept. They loved me for being me, but then they wanted me to change, and I just couldn't. One surprising revelation is that, out of Gregg's 6 marriages, he only proposed once. In all the others, including his marriage to Cher, it was his partner who initiated the proposal. This fact raises an interesting question. Was Gregg Allman truly a man who wanted to commit to marriage, or was he simply going along with the flow of life? Gregg never denied that he was a difficult man to be with. Music was always the greatest love of his life, and every woman who came into his world had to accept taking a back seat to that. He once shared that his life revolved around music, and nothing could change that. For the women who loved him, this might have been part of his initial allure, a passionate artist, untamed and uninhibited. But in the end, when they hoped for stability, for a real family life, Gregg couldn't meet those expectations. What do you think about Gregg Allman's perspective? In love, do people truly accept their partners for who they are, or do they inevitably try to change them into what they want them to be? After Cher and Gregg Allman's marriage ended, they moved forward on vastly different paths. Cher quickly regained her momentum and continued to shine, while Gregg struggled with lingering personal issues, from addiction to a string of failed marriages. Looking back, it's clear that their divorce didn't affect them in the same way. One rose stronger than ever, while the other seemed trapped in the same destructive cycles. Despite the pain of her failed marriage to Gregg, Cher didn't let it derail her career. Shortly after their split, she returned to the spotlight with a string of chart-topping hits, solidifying her place as one of the industry's top artists. In 1979, 2 years after separating from Gregg, Cher released the album Take Me Home, with its title track becoming one of her biggest hits. The upbeat disco anthem marked a shift in her musical style, proving that she wasn't just a pop singer, but an artist capable of evolving with the trends. The 1980s continued to be a period of great success for Cher. She transitioned into acting and, in 1988, won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in Moonstruck. In music, she kept making waves with hits like If I Could Turn Back Time in 1989, one of the biggest songs of her career. Instead of damaging her career, her failed marriage to Gregg seemed to have made her even stronger, more independent, and free from the constraints of any relationship. In her personal life, Cher didn't rush into another marriage. After Gregg, she had high-profile relationships with several well-known figures, including Gene Simmons of Kiss and actor Tom Cruise, but she never remarried. Cher seemed to realize that she didn't need a marriage to be happy, and that only made her even more powerful in the eyes of the public. While Cher rose above the breakup, Gregg Allman fell deeper into his struggles with alcohol and drugs. His addiction had existed long before his marriage to Cher, but after the divorce, it spiraled even further out of control. The consequences of his destructive habits not only stalled his career, but also deeply affected his personal life. He married 4 more times after Cher, yet he never found lasting stability in any of those relationships. Just 2 years after their split, Gregg remarried Julie Bindus in 1979. This marriage seemed to be an attempt at finding stability after his turbulent relationship with Cher. The couple had a daughter, Delilah Island Allman, but their relationship didn't last. After just 2 years, they divorced in 1981, marking yet another failed marriage for Gregg. Nearly a decade later, he entered his 4th marriage with Danielle Galliano in 1989. By then, he had somewhat regained control over his addiction, but their differences still made the relationship unsustainable. After 5 years, they parted ways in 1994. It seemed that Gregg never gave up hope of finding a long-term marriage. In 2001, he married Stacey Fountain, making it his longest-lasting marriage since Cher. They were together for nearly 7 years, but once again, personal struggles and lifestyle differences led to their divorce in 2008. In his later years, Gregg married for the 6th and final time to Shannon Williams, a woman 40 years younger than him. They wed in 2017, but tragically, it was the same year that Gregg passed away due to complications from liver cancer. Despite multiple marriages, Gregg Allman never found true stability. He continued battling his old demons, and even when he managed to get back on his feet after years of addiction, he couldn't maintain a lasting marriage. Looking back, it's evident that Cher and Gregg Allman took completely different paths after their divorce. Cher flourished in her career, growing more independent and powerful, never allowing herself to be tied down by another marriage. She transformed heartbreak into motivation, rising to become one of the most influential female artists of all time. Meanwhile, Gregg never truly escaped his own self-destructive cycle. He kept marrying, but never found long-term happiness, and his battle with substance abuse lasted until his final years. In the end, he passed away in 2017, leaving behind an extraordinary musical legacy, but also a life filled with turmoil and regret. It's fair to say that Gregg Allman suffered more from their divorce, not just because his career stalled, but because he never found the stability he may have longed for. Meanwhile, Cher walked away from the marriage stronger than ever. Though their marriage couldn't last, Gregg Allman and Cher maintained a rare kind of relationship, not as husband and wife, but not as strangers either. They had once loved each other passionately, hurt each other deeply, yet in the end, they still held on to a sense of respect and connection in their own way. After their divorce, Cher and Gregg never completely cut ties. They didn't see each other often, but they stayed on good enough terms to call or check in when needed. Despite the pain of the past, both understood that their relationship had been something special, and there was no reason to turn it into resentment. They had gone through a turbulent journey together, but when looking back, what remained were cherished memories rather than bitterness. This became most evident in 2017 when Gregg Allman fell gravely ill due to complications from liver cancer. Despite the many years that had passed, Cher decided to visit him in his final days. That visit was more than just a polite gesture. It was a sign of the deep connection that still existed between them, one that transcended past wounds and differences. Cher didn't visit him as just an old acquaintance. In that moment, she returned to being someone who had once loved Gregg and wanted to be there for him as his time ran out. Gregg Allman, too, never dismissed the importance of his relationship with Cher. In a later interview, he said, "We're good friends now. I wouldn't do it again, but I will always cherish what we had." His words carried both a sense of honesty and a maturity that had come with time. He understood that they were never meant to be together, but that didn't mean he couldn't appreciate the beautiful moments they had shared. This mutual respect was further demonstrated when Cher publicly expressed her sorrow after Gregg's passing on May 27, 2017. She immediately took to social media to mourn, writing, "I have lost a longtime friend. Gregg was a talented man with a beautiful soul." But Cher's words weren't just a simple tribute. In later interviews, she spoke candidly about how she felt when she learned of Gregg's death. She admitted that even though they had gone their separate ways long ago, his passing still left her with a deep sadness, not just for losing an old friend, but because he had been a significant part of her life's story. "We had some very difficult years, but I will always remember Gregg for the best parts of who he was," she said in a 2017 interview. She also reflected on the past, admitting that if she could turn back time, she might have tried to understand Gregg more instead of trying to change him. Her words revealed that, despite their failed marriage, their relationship had meaning. It left Cher with profound lessons about love, acceptance, and the realization that sometimes, no matter how much two people love each other, they simply aren't meant to stay together. Though they were no longer husband and wife, the bond Cher had with Gregg never completely faded. It was no longer the fiery passion of the past, but a deep sense of respect for a man who had once been an important part of her life. In the end, Gregg Allman and Cher's relationship after divorce proved that not all marriages end in complete destruction. Some loves may not survive within marriage, but they can endure in another form, a quiet, lasting connection that, in their case, remained until the very end. Looking back on his final years, perhaps Gregg Allman also wondered, could he have done things differently? The failed marriages, the downward spiral of alcohol and drugs, the moments of being lost, all seemed to have pulled him away from the path he once dreamed of. But through all the chaos, one thing never abandoned him: music. To many, Gregg Allman was a wild rock star, a man who couldn't be tamed. But to him, music was always a sanctuary. No matter how turbulent his personal life became, when he stood in front of a microphone, when his fingers danced across the keyboard, Gregg was himself, raw, emotional, and unfiltered. And it was music that ultimately helped him rise from the darkness. After the Allman Brothers Band disbanded in the late 1970s, Gregg entered a period of uncertainty in his career. He quickly pursued a solo path, releasing Laid Back, 1973, an album that received critical acclaim but failed to make a significant commercial impact. Changing music trends and his own personal instability made it difficult for Gregg to maintain his place in the industry. However, the Allman Brothers Band was never truly gone. After a period of hiatus, the band reunited in the early 1980s with some lineup changes, continuing to tour and release new albums. Yet they never regained the same influence they once had. This reflected the shifting landscape of rock music. Southern rock was gradually being overshadowed by emerging genres like new wave and arena rock, forcing both the band and Gregg's solo career to navigate an evolving industry. Gregg continued to battle personal demons, and by the early 1980s, he had nearly lost the aura of a rock star. But instead of letting the past consume him, he embarked on a journey of rediscovering himself through his solo career. In 1987, he made a triumphant return with the album I'm No Angel, which reignited his presence in the music world. The title track became a major hit, marking a stylistic shift in his music, leaning more toward blues rock and soul rather than traditional Southern rock. This was a defining moment in his career, proving that he wasn't just a part of the Allman Brothers Band, but a true solo artist in his own right. One of Gregg Allman's most iconic songs is Melissa, a track that has become a defining piece of his legacy. But few people know that this song was written long before the Allman Brothers Band even existed. Gregg once shared that he wrote Melissa in the early 1960s when he was still an unknown musician, struggling to find his place in the industry. At the time, the melody and lyrics were nearly complete, but he couldn't settle on a title that truly captured the song's essence. For weeks, he searched for the perfect name, but nothing felt right. Then one day, while shopping at a small grocery store, he overheard a mother calling out to her child, "Melissa, where are you?" It was a simple moment, but it stirred something deep inside him. At that instant, he knew. Melissa was the name he had been searching for. Melissa was a piece of Gregg Allman's soul. It wasn't a powerful rock anthem, nor did it feature intricate guitar riffs. Instead, it was a simple, tender song filled with emotion, speaking of longing, solitude, and the journeys one must take throughout life. However, when Melissa was released on the Eat a Peach album in 1972, it didn't immediately become a hit. At the time, audiences were more familiar with the Allman Brothers Band's high-energy Southern rock sound, and a gentle ballad like Melissa wasn't what fans expected from them. But over time, the song grew in popularity, becoming one of the most requested tracks at Gregg's live performances. Today, Melissa is regarded as one of the finest ballads of 1970s rock and remains one of Gregg Allman's most iconic songs. In his later years, whenever Gregg performed Melissa on stage, he carried a certain reverence for it. No elaborate theatrics, no grand effects, just him, his guitar, and the nostalgic melodies. It was in these moments that audiences saw the real Gregg Allman, not the wild rock star, but a true musician, a man who dedicated his life to storytelling through music. Despite the mistakes in his life, no one can deny the legacy Gregg Allman left behind. In 1995, he and the Allman Brothers Band were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a well-deserved recognition of his contributions to music. Additionally, his 2011 album Low Country Blues earned a Grammy nomination, proving that even beyond his peak years, Gregg Allman remained a lasting influence in the industry. Gregg Allman wasn't just one of the most important artists in Southern rock. He was an inspiration to generations of musicians. Artists like Chris Stapleton, Jason Isbell, and even Keith Urban have cited him as a major influence on their own musical styles. From a rock star lost in endless indulgence, he rose beyond his darkest days to become a legend. An artist remembered not only for his celebrated career, but also for the deeply emotional music that touched millions of hearts. Though Gregg Allman may be gone, his music will live on forever. The love story between Gregg Allman and Cher began like a storm. Passionate, explosive, yet carrying signs of instability from the very start. They were drawn to each other, seemingly two perfect halves, but in reality, they belonged to entirely different worlds. Gregg was a wild Southern soul, an artist who lived for music and refused to be tied down. Cher was a Hollywood icon where fame, the spotlight, and career ambitions always came first. When these two worlds collided, it was no surprise that everything fell apart so quickly. Addiction, clashing lifestyles, and irreconcilable differences led to a marriage that lasted just over 2 years. Cher fought to save it, but in the end, she realized that some battles cannot be won, especially when the only person who could change wasn't willing to do so. Gregg, despite loving Cher, couldn't abandon the life of a wandering rocker, nor could he let go of the habits that had become ingrained in him. Yet, despite the painful ending, there was no hatred between them, only mutual respect. When Gregg lay on his deathbed in his final days, Cher came to visit him. There were no more fights, no more conflicts, just two people who had once loved each other, now looking back on their past with appreciation. Gregg himself acknowledged this when he said, "We're good friends now. I wouldn't do it again, but I will always cherish what we had." Their marriage was not a fairy tale with a happy ending. It was proof that sometimes love alone is not enough. There are people we love deeply, but cannot walk beside until the end. There are relationships filled with regrets, yet still worth treasuring for the beautiful moments they once held. And for Gregg Allman and Cher, they may not have been able to stay together, but they never truly lost each other either. In marriage, do we truly love our partner as they are, or do we always hope they will change to fit our expectations? If love is not enough to change a person, is it enough to sustain a marriage? It's not always about right or wrong. Sometimes, it's simply a matter of choice. Hit like and subscribe to never miss an untold story about music legends. Join us as we uncover hidden truths, moments of triumph, and tragedies behind the spotlight. This journey has many more surprises waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to continue discovering more fascinating stories.